"There you are," the silver-haired woman called as Daniel Mercer knelt in the snow gathering shirts that had spilled from his broken suitcase across the courthouse steps. 7 minutes earlier, his marriage had ended. Now a black helicopter was beating the winter air above him, and Helena Ashford, one of the most powerful industrialists in the country, had come looking for the maintenance worker everyone else had dismissed. Daniel was not a disgraced husband waiting to be rescued. He was the overlooked safety specialist whose private design could protect thousands of passengers. He had spent years keeping broken machines alive while his own life collapsed beyond repair. And the opportunity Helena offered him was about to place 12 lives, his mother's final days, and everything left of his name in the hands of one decision. If you believe quiet courage deserves to be recognized, subscribe and stay with us as Daniel's real fight begins. Daniel Mercer had spent almost 20 years learning that machines rarely failed without warning. A bearing whispered before it screamed. A cable trembled differently when its inner strands began to weaken. A motor gave off the faint odor of scorched insulation long before the temperature gauge admitted anything was wrong. People Daniel had discovered were harder to read. By the time his marriage began making noises, he could no longer ignore the damage had already spread into places no wrench could reach. At 40, Daniel worked as the lead mechanical and safety technician at Summit Crest, a luxury ski resort built along the mountains above Silver Ridge, Colorado. Guests paying thousands of dollars for a weekend rarely noticed him unless the heat stopped. An elevator stalled, or a gondola shuddered in the wind. He wore a charcoal work jacket with his name stitched above the pocket, carried a battered radio on his belt, and knew every maintenance tunnel beneath the polished stone lobby. He knew which generator hesitated below zero, which boiler valve stuck after heavy snowfall, and which support tower leaned just enough to frighten new inspectors, even though it had not shifted in more than a decade. To Summit Crest's executives, Daniel was dependable labor. To the younger technicians, he was the man they called before calling management. He had no engineering degree framed on a wall, but he had completed advanced rope access training, high-angle rescue certification, emergency evacuation courses, and nearly every state safety program available to a field technician. Years earlier, during a sudden wind shutdown, he had climbed a frozen tower and helped lower 2 terrified tourists from a stalled cabin. No reporters covered it. The resort gave him a grocery store gift card and returned him to the night schedule the following week. Daniel had never minded being invisible. He believed good work mattered even when no one applauded. That belief had once been one of the things Vanessa loved about him. When they first met, Vanessa Brooks was an assistant event coordinator with a color-coded notebook and a 5-year plan. Daniel was repairing a failed lighting panel during a charity dinner she had organized. While executives panicked in the ballroom, he restored power with a flashlight between his teeth and apologized for the delay as though darkness had been a personal insult. Vanessa later told him that everyone else had been performing competence while Daniel had simply been competent. 11 years into their marriage, she was the communications director for North Star Holdings, a national resort development company, and still organized her life in neat blocks of time. Her clothes were immaculate. Her emails were answered before breakfast. She could walk into a room full of angry investors and make them believe a crisis was merely a transition with poor branding. Daniel admired that certainty because he possessed none of it outside mechanical rooms. Their home in Silver Ridge reflected Vanessa's careful taste. Pale walls, clean counters, framed photographs arranged at exact distances, and a narrow oak table where they had once eaten dinner together every night. In the early years, Vanessa planned their vacations while Daniel repaired whatever went wrong along the way. She booked the rooms. He fixed the rental car. She remembered birthdays. He built shelves, patched roofs, and made coffee before she woke. For a long time, their differences fit together. Then Daniel's mother suffered a stroke. Ruth Mercer lived alone in Pine Hollow, nearly 3 hours away in the modest blue house where Daniel had grown up. She had taught elementary school for 34 years and still kept handwritten thank-you notes from former students in a biscuit tin above the refrigerator. The stroke was considered mild. Ruth regained her speech, could walk without assistance, and insisted she was perfectly capable of living alone. But small failures began appearing. She called Daniel to ask whether it was morning when the sun was setting. She left grocery bags in the trunk overnight. Once she placed the television remote in the freezer and accused the cable company of stealing it. Another time, a neighbor smelled smoke and found a saucepan burning on the stove, while Ruth sat in the backyard feeding birds. Daniel began driving to Pine Hollow every Friday after work. He filled her pill organizer, repaired loose railings, paid bills she had forgotten, stocked the refrigerator, and labeled drawers in large black letters. On Sunday evenings, he drove back through mountain traffic, often arriving after Vanessa had gone to bed. At first, Vanessa tried to help. She ordered an automatic medication dispenser, contacted home care agencies, and created a shared calendar for Ruth's appointments. She packed sandwiches for Daniel, and once spent an entire Saturday reorganizing Ruth's kitchen so important items were easier to find. But when Vanessa suggested moving Ruth into an assisted living community near Silver Ridge, Daniel refused before she had finished explaining the costs. Ruth had once made him promise she would never be forced from her home. Daniel treated that promise as sacred. Vanessa treated it as a decision that should have belonged to both of them. Months turned into years. They canceled a trip to Vancouver after Ruth wandered into the wrong medical office. Daniel missed North Star's annual gala because his mother fell beside the bathtub. On their 10th anniversary, Vanessa sat alone at a restaurant while Daniel waited in a Pine Hollow emergency room beneath fluorescent lights. He sent flowers. The card arrived with her name misspelled. There was no affair, no violence, and no single betrayal dramatic enough to explain the distance growing between them. There were only hundreds of smaller absences. Vanessa stopped asking what time Daniel would be home. Daniel stopped telling her when he was frightened. He believed he was protecting her from a burden she had not chosen. She believed he had stopped seeing her as part of his family. During those same years, Summit Crest faced an expensive problem with its oldest gondola line. A manufacturer had discontinued a small locking assembly used in the emergency braking system. The resort's engineering consultant recommended replacing the entire drive unit, a project that would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and close the line for most of the winter. Daniel studied the worn mechanism and became convinced the load could be redistributed through a dual-contact emergency locking collar, reducing stress on the obsolete part without interfering with the primary brake. He submitted a written proposal to Summit Crest. Management rejected it. The operations director sent an email stating that the resort would not fund, test, develop, or claim responsibility for an uncertified employee concept. Daniel printed the response and stored it with his records. He then continued working on the idea outside company hours using his own money and a small workshop behind Ruth's house. He bought scrap steel machined rough prototypes and recorded every measurement in a blue cloth-bound notebook. For daily reference, he also created a copied design folder that he carried to work. Vanessa often woke to find him at the dining table, sketching force paths beside cold coffee. One evening, after she had spent an hour waiting for him to notice the dinner she had prepared, she lifted the blue notebook and asked whether broken machines were the only things that still made him feel needed. Daniel heard accusation instead of pain. He took the notebook, carried it to the garage, and placed it inside his old metal toolbox. Neither of them apologized. Ruth's condition worsened in early winter. A police officer found her walking beside a rural road after midnight in slippers and a thin nightgown. She said she was going to school because her students were waiting. The doctor told Daniel that leaving her alone was no longer safe and recommended part-time in-home care immediately. He also warned that Ruth's prior stroke left her vulnerable to another more serious event. She might experience brief periods of clarity, he explained, but her condition would likely continue to decline. The monthly cost of care was more than Daniel could absorb. Vanessa and Daniel had been saving for a down payment on a smaller house closer to town, a home Vanessa believed might finally give them a fresh start. Daniel knew what she would say if he asked to use the money. More truthfully, he feared what her answer might reveal about their marriage. So he did not ask. He withdrew part of their emergency savings and hired a caregiver for Ruth 4 afternoons a week. He told himself he would replace the money with overtime before Vanessa ever noticed. Then Summit Crest's winter bookings fell, management froze overtime, and Daniel's private solution became another problem he could not repair. Vanessa discovered the withdrawals while preparing loan documents. Daniel came home one Thursday night carrying groceries and found her standing at the kitchen island with bank statements spread in front of her. She wore the dark green dress she used for investor presentations, but she had removed her shoes, and the exhaustion on her face frightened him more than anger would have. "Tell me this is a mistake," she said. Daniel set down the bags. He considered lying for less than a second, which was long enough to shame him. He explained Ruth's wandering, the doctor's warning the caregiver, and the overtime that had disappeared. He spoke quickly, piling facts over the silence. Vanessa listened until he said he had been trying to protect her. "Protect me from what she asked, from being your wife." Daniel said she had already made her feelings about Ruth clear. Vanessa reminded him that she had researched caregivers, doctors, and housing options while he rejected every suggestion that did not match his promise. He accused her of seeing his mother as an inconvenience between business dinners and real estate plans. Vanessa flinched, then said the words that would remain with him long after the argument ended. "You do not share responsibility, Daniel. You take away everyone else's right to choose, then call yourself the good man for carrying it alone." He told her she cared more about how their life looked than how people inside it felt. She said he had turned sacrifice into a locked door and expected her to admire him from the other side. By midnight, the groceries were still sweating on the counter. 2 weeks later, Vanessa asked for a divorce. Daniel did not fight her. He apologized, promised to repay the savings, and moved into the guest room while lawyers converted 11 years into property lists, account balances, and carefully worded emails. Yet even as his marriage collapsed, Daniel continued working because machines still obeyed causes and consequences. Then, during the worst snowstorm of the season, Summit Crest's oldest gondola line failed. The resort had closed to guests, but 6 employees were returning from the upper station when a cabin jerked backward and stopped above a ravine. Warning lights flashed across the control panel. The primary brake held released, then caught again. Daniel recognized the pattern immediately. The obsolete locking assembly was slipping under uneven load. Wind hammered the towers, and visibility dropped below 30 yards. The operations manager wanted to wait for the county rescue team, but Daniel knew repeated movement could fracture the worn component. He put on a climbing harness, led 2 trained technicians onto the tower, and crossed the service line through blowing snow. For nearly an hour, Daniel worked with ice forming on his gloves while the cabin groaned beneath him. He secured the brake housing, stabilized the line, and helped lower all 6 employees to safety. When he returned to the maintenance building, his face was raw from the wind, and his hands would not stop shaking. He opened the copied design folder and confirmed what he had feared. His locking collar might have prevented the backward slip. While the storm continued outside, Daniel carried the folder through a service corridor and found an older woman sitting alone on a folding bench. Her silver hair was damp, 1 boot was unfastened, and a polished cane rested across her knees. She had been visiting Summit Crest to inspect a supplier project and meet local investors when the storm grounded her helicopter. Her driver had gone to find another route down the mountain. She refused Daniel's offer to call a nurse, so he brought her into the maintenance office, wrapped a thermal blanket around her shoulders, and made coffee in a stained machine no guest was supposed to see. The mug he handed her read, "World's Most Tolerable Boss." She laughed. Daniel did not know she was Helena Ashford, founder and chief executive of Ashford Alpine Technologies, one of the largest manufacturers of mountain transport and rescue systems in the country. To him, she was simply an exhausted woman stranded in bad weather. Helena noticed the copied diagrams beside his radio and asked what he had been drawing. Daniel hesitated, then showed her the locking collar concept. He explained the discontinued component Summit Crest's written rejection, the private prototypes, and his belief that thousands of older systems could remain safe, if engineers stopped treating total replacement as the only respectable solution. Helena asked permission to photograph several pages and requested his personal email. Daniel gave it to her, expecting nothing. Before dawn, the roads reopened and Helena left. Over the next several weeks, Ashford Alpine Technologies tried to contact Daniel. He never saw the messages. The divorce had entered its final stage. Ruth needed more supervision, and every unopened notification felt like another demand he could not meet. An intellectual property investigator hired by Ashford eventually confirmed Daniel's address, employment, and upcoming final divorce hearing through public legal records. Helena was already scheduled to fly from a nearby inspection to Denver that morning. When her assistant realized Daniel would be at the Silver Ridge Courthouse, Helena changed course. The divorce hearing took less than 20 minutes. Vanessa kept the house because her mother had provided most of the original down payment. Daniel kept his truck, his tools, and a share of the debt. He arrived with a damaged suitcase because he had returned his keys the previous night and slept in a roadside motel. Vanessa stood on the courthouse steps with her sister Camille and 2 North Star colleagues. She looked composed in a cream coat, but Daniel could see that she had not slept. When the papers were signed, Vanessa followed him outside as though waiting for a final sentence. Daniel wanted to thank her for the years that had been good. He wanted to admit she had been right about the choices he denied her. He wanted to tell her he did not hate her. Camille folded her arms and said, "At least now you'll have more time for the broken machines you love more than people." Daniel tightened his grip on the suitcase and walked away. At the bottom of the steps, one wheel caught in a crack. The zipper split, spilling shirt socks and the copied design folder onto the wet stone. Daniel crouched to gather his life while strangers moved around him. Then a deep mechanical thunder rolled over the courthouse lawn. Snow scattered beneath the descending wind as a black helicopter bearing the Ashford emblem settled beyond the security barrier. Helena stepped onto the grass, leaning on her polished cane. "There you are," she called. "My company has been trying to find you for a month." Her engineers had modeled the locking collar. Preliminary results suggested it could extend the safe service life of older gondola systems across the country. She offered Daniel a seat to Denver, a preliminary technical review, and the chance to discuss a licensing agreement if ownership and testing could be verified. Daniel looked back at Vanessa. Her expression held no simple jealousy, only shocked regret, and the painful recognition that the man she had stopped understanding possessed a value neither of them had known how to name. Helena extended her hand. Daniel closed the suitcase around what remained and walked toward the helicopter. The Ashford campus occupied 3 glass buildings linked by enclosed walkways. Beyond the offices stood test towers, cable rigs, environmental chambers, and a mechanical laboratory filled with equipment Daniel had previously seen only in trade magazines. Helena did not take him directly to the boardroom. First, she introduced him to a small technical review team led by Priya Nanduri, a mechanical engineer whose father had spent 30 years repairing agricultural equipment before she attended college. Priya understood that practical knowledge often arrived without polished language. The team verified Summit Crest's rejection email, Daniel's personal receipts, and the dated files in his copied folder. They visited Ruth's workshop, photographed the prototypes, and confirmed that Daniel had developed the concept independently. Only after the legal team cleared the ownership issue did Helena formally propose licensing discussions and a temporary field consulting role. That was when Daniel met Martin Vale. Martin was Ashford's chief technical officer, silver at the temples, and composed in the way of a man who had spent years being the most qualified person in every room. His degrees were displayed in biographies, conference programs, and press releases. He shook Daniel's hand politely, then asked what professional engineering licenses Daniel held. Daniel admitted he held none. Martin asked about advanced mathematics, certification experience, and liability assessment. Daniel answered honestly. "Then we should be careful," Martin said, not to confuse practical intuition with engineering validation. Helena placed the verified ownership report on the table. That is why validation exists, she replied. To test ideas, not prevent them from entering the building. Daniel received a small office, a company laptop, and 2 weeks to prepare a technical presentation for the Executive Review Board. He worked closely with Priya and a laboratory team. Some welcomed him. Others saw him as a publicity story Helena had brought in through the side door. One engineer joked that Daniel's official title should be Garage Innovation Specialist. Daniel pretended not to hear. He spent his first days translating things he understood with his hands into equations and diagrams other people could approve. His instinct told him where metal would flex, where grease would thicken, and where an exhausted technician might make a mistake at 3 in the morning. The team demanded numerical proof. Daniel did not resent that. What unsettled him was the suggestion that knowledge only became real after someone with a degree renamed it. At night, he drove to Pine Hollow to check on Ruth. She had begun calling him by his father's name. Once she opened the door and asked whether Daniel had come to repair the refrigerator. He smiled, fixed a loose cabinet hinge that did not need fixing, and waited until she remembered him. Her caregiver reported that Ruth had tried to leave the house twice that week. Daniel increased the caregiver's hours even though the contract had not been finalized. He told no one at Ashford. He slept 4 hours a night, kept a second shirt in his truck, and arrived at meetings with coffee strong enough to hurt his stomach. Helena noticed. "You look worse with every opportunity I give you," she said one evening. Daniel told her he was adjusting. "That is not an answer," she replied. "It is what people say when they want help to stop asking questions." Daniel changed the subject. The executive presentation took place 2 weeks after he arrived in Denver. Daniel had rehearsed for days, yet the moment the board members looked at him, every prepared sentence sounded false. He began by explaining the obsolete assembly, but Martin interrupted to ask about statistical fatigue limits. Daniel answered correctly, though not elegantly. Another executive asked him to quantify liability exposure across varying installation conditions. Daniel tried to describe how ice entered a housing after a seal hardened in extreme cold. Martin smiled faintly. "Anecdotes are not data, Mr. Mercer." Daniel lost his place, skipped 2 slides, repeated an explanation, and called a board member by the wrong name. Martin concluded that the concept deserved controlled research, but that placing Daniel in any decision-making role would be premature. Afterward, Daniel went to Helena's office to resign. Helena did not accept the envelope he placed on her desk. "You failed at a presentation," she said. "You did not fail at the work." Daniel replied that the board wanted someone who spoke their language. "Then learn enough of their language to stop them from using it as a locked door," Helena said. "But do not let them convince you that a clean slide deck knows more about a frozen machine than you do." Daniel stayed. Over the next 2 months, the locking collar survived heat cycling ice exposure, repeated emergency loads, and simulated cable shock. Daniel identified a stress concentration the computer model had underestimated. He earned the technicians' trust by entering the test chamber with them instead of watching through glass. Even skeptical engineers began asking for his judgment. Martin remained publicly supportive and privately obstructive. He delayed approvals, questioned expenses, and forced the program toward an aggressive schedule tied to a pending sale of Ashford's cable transport division to Meridian Peak Capital. If the division completed its safety upgrade program under budget before the end of the quarter, Martin would receive a large bonus and become president of the merged operation. Helena had once trusted Martin because he delivered results, protected margins, and made difficult programs appear controlled. She had allowed financial performance to concentrate too much authority in his office. That failure would later become part of her own reckoning. The first field trial was scheduled at Glacier Point. Because the locking collar was not yet certified for occupied operation, the rescue cabin carried only instrumented weights. 4 technicians monitored the test from a reinforced service platform near the first tower. Daniel, Priya, Martin. Helena and resort officials watched from the control station. The cabin moved onto the line and stopped. The team triggered a controlled failure in the primary brake. For 1 second, everything worked exactly as designed. The weighted cabin slid backward. Daniel's locking collar engaged. The secondary load path caught the system and prevented uncontrolled descent. Then a sharp crack came through the radio. One mounting point tore loose. The empty test cabin swung sideways and struck the service platform. A technician was thrown against a railing, breaking his arm and cutting his forehead. Daniel was moving before anyone told him to. He helped the rescue team stabilize the platform and lower the injured man. When he reached the ground, Martin was already speaking to the resort's attorneys. The prototype failed under test conditions, Martin said loudly enough for everyone to hear. Daniel stared at the broken mounting bracket. The collar held. The fastener failed. Martin replied that the distinction would not matter to the injured technician. Ashford suspended the trial and impounded every component. Daniel spent the night reviewing footage. Frame by frame, he watched the collar engage exactly as intended. The mounting bolt snapped several seconds later. Under the approved specification, that bolt should have survived far greater force. Daniel requested a formal materials test. Before the independent team arrived, he weighed an identical unused fastener from the same shipment under supervision. It was lighter than the required alloy. A hardness test confirmed that the shipment contained cheaper steel that became brittle in extreme cold. Daniel brought the preliminary results to Martin. Martin closed the office door before reading them. The formal investigation will determine whether the sample is representative, he said. Daniel told him another resort was preparing equipment using the same shipment. Martin said the investigation team would review it. Daniel asked when. Martin answered with procedural language that protected the company better than it protected people. Daniel took the information to Helena. She believed the materials evidence, but she also knew the board would demand independent confirmation. She requested 48 hours to bring in outside inspectors and preserve the procurement chain. Daniel agreed until he learned that Timberline Ridge planned a maintenance cabin test using the same batch the next morning. He called the resort's safety manager directly and urged an inspection before operation. Timberline halted the test and discovered a hairline fracture in one fastener. No one was injured. Martin used Daniel's unauthorized disclosure to suspend him for violating confidentiality. He framed the act as reckless behavior by an inventor trying to protect his reputation. Within days, parts of the story appeared in the press. Headlines described Daniel as an unlicensed mechanic whose experimental device had injured a worker. Anonymous company sources claimed Helena had bypassed standard procedures because she wanted a public relations story about discovering hidden talent. The campaign came from Latham Gray Strategies, an outside crisis management firm connected to Martin and supported by a board member who favored the Meridian Peak sale. Martin did not control every department, but he had built a network of aligned interests: procurement staff protecting their jobs, directors protecting the merger, consultants protecting their contract, and legal officers protecting the company from immediate liability. The system amplified his power. Vanessa recognized the campaign's structure. The articles quoted different sources but repeated identical phrases. She had worked with Latham Gray during an earlier North Star crisis and knew how coordinated reputational attacks were disguised as independent reporting. She called Daniel. He answered from Ruth's hospital parking lot after learning his mother had fallen in the bathroom. "I saw the reports," Vanessa said. Daniel heard judgment in the hesitation before her next sentence. "You want to know if they are true. I want to know what happened. The same thing that always happens. People with power decide what the truth should sound like. Vanessa said she might be able to trace the media campaign." Daniel laughed bitterly. "Now you want to manage my image." "That is not what I said. You spent years believing I was a man disappearing into broken things. Now the whole country agrees with you." Vanessa went quiet, then answered calmly. "I never said you had no value. I said you never let me stand beside you. Even now you would rather fight me than tell me you are scared." Daniel ended the call. Ruth's doctor said she had not broken any bones, but her confusion was increasing. When Daniel entered her room, she looked at him without recognition, then called him Thomas, his father's name. Daniel sat beside her until sunset. Just before dinner, Ruth's eyes cleared during one of the brief, lucid intervals the doctor had described. "Daniel," she said. He leaned forward, afraid the moment would disappear. Ruth touched the dark circles beneath his eyes. "Why do you always look like you are apologizing to the whole world?" Daniel admitted that he had failed Vanessa, that a technician had been injured, and that no matter how hard he tried, Ruth was still slipping away. "I did not ask you to save me from getting old," she said. "Love is not supposed to be a punishment you give yourself." Daniel asked what he should do. Ruth looked toward the darkening window. "Tell the truth. Then let other people decide whether they are brave enough to stand with you." It was the last fully lucid conversation they would ever have. Vanessa returned to the house she and Daniel had once shared. The words from their phone call stayed with her. She understood better than anyone how powerful people shaped truth through language repetition and controlled access. Helping Daniel would not restore their marriage, but she could no longer pretend the campaign against him was simply a technical dispute. In the garage behind camping equipment and unopened boxes, she found Daniel's old metal toolbox. Inside lay the original blue notebook personal receipts for prototype materials, the printed Summit Crest rejection, and an external drive. On the home computer, she found the original file Daniel had emailed years earlier. The time-stamped specifications clearly required high-strength alloy fasteners. Vanessa mapped the press leaks and discovered Latham Gray had contacted journalists before Ashford publicly announced Daniel's suspension. Someone had prepared his destruction before the investigation reached a conclusion. Daniel returned to Denver after arranging temporary nursing care for Ruth. Officially suspended, he no longer had access to Ashford systems. Priya met him privately and admitted that procurement records had been altered after the Glacier Point accident. An engineer named Lucas Avery had supposedly approved the substitute fasteners, but Lucas denied authorizing the change. Lucas was frightened. Martin had threatened to end his career and hold him financially responsible if he contradicted the official report. Glacier Point's local archive was maintained by the resort, not Ashford, and the site's access system had not yet received the company's suspension update. With permission from the resort's night supervisor, who believed the safety records should be preserved, Daniel entered the equipment building with Lucas. They found archived receiving logs showing that Martin's office had ordered cheaper steel across several projects, then divided the costs among expense categories to avoid audit review. The same supplier had received payments shortly before Meridian Peak issued its purchase offer. Daniel copied the files. Before he could leave, Ashford security officers entered with local police. Martin appeared behind them, accompanied by the board member supporting the merger. Lucas panicked and denied giving Daniel permission. Daniel was detained for questioning and accused of trespassing and stealing confidential information. By morning, Martin's allies had deleted the central server folders and produced an internal report blaming Daniel for unauthorized design changes. Ashford terminated Daniel's temporary contract under board pressure. His licensing payments were frozen. Helena was removed from direct control of the cable transport division pending review, though she remained the company's chief executive. She called Daniel from outside the police station and promised to fight. He heard helplessness in her voice. Then the hospital called. Ruth had suffered another stroke during the night. Daniel drove through snow so thick traffic crawled behind plows. He arrived after sunrise. Ruth had died 23 minutes earlier. A nurse told him she had been comfortable. Before the end, they played an old voicemail in which Daniel reminded her to take her medicine and promised to visit on Friday. Ruth appeared to relax when she heard his voice. Daniel sat beside the bed and held the hand he had spent years trying to protect. For the first time, there was nothing left for him to repair. The funeral took place 4 days later beneath a gray sky. Former students, neighbors, and retired teachers came to honor Ruth. Helena stayed away because reporters surrounded every connection to Daniel. Priya sent flowers without the company name. Vanessa arrived alone. Camille followed and whispered that Daniel's choices had finally destroyed everything around him. Vanessa turned on her sister. Leave. Camille argued that she was only telling the truth. Vanessa repeated the word until Camille walked away. After the burial, Vanessa handed Daniel the original blue notebook, the receipts, the rejected Summit Crest proposal, the external drive, and a folder containing the time-stamped design. She explained the coordinated press campaign and the link between Martin's consultants, the supportive board member, and Meridian Peak. This proves the material was changed, she said, and it proves you owned the design before Ashford contacted you. Daniel stared at the documents. Months earlier, he would have considered them salvation. Now they felt like papers from another man's life. Vanessa apologized for not understanding the difference between Daniel's devotion and his silence until both had already damaged them. Daniel told her she had been right. He had made choices for everyone, then expected his suffering to excuse the consequences. Neither apology restored what had ended, but for the first time they stood together without defending themselves. That evening, Daniel returned to Ruth's empty house. Her slippers remained beside the chair. A grocery list in her handwriting was attached to the refrigerator, though half the words no longer made sense. He placed the blue notebook inside the fireplace and built kindling beneath it. Martin had lawyers, directors, consultants, and a story the public already believed. Ruth was gone. Vanessa was no longer his wife. The work Daniel thought might give meaning to his life had instead injured a man and exposed him to ruin. He struck a match. The flame burned down toward his fingers before his phone began to ring. Helena's name glowed on the screen. Daniel nearly ignored it. Then he answered. Daniel, I need you to listen before you decide to hang up. Helena's voice was strained, sharpened by wind and distant alarms. A braking pressure failure had been reported at Eagle Crown, one of the largest resorts in the state. The resort had received mounting hardware from the same supplier used at Glacier Point. Management had begun evacuating the line, but a power fluctuation struck before the final cabin reached the station. 12 passengers were suspended above a ravine. The primary brake had lost pressure. The secondary housing was deforming. A storm front was less than an hour away. Their rescue engineers have your preliminary drawings, Helena said. They do not understand the wear pattern in the old system. You do. Daniel looked at the notebook above the kindling. Find someone else. There is no one else who has worked with both systems. Then shut the mountain down. They are trying. The cabin is already trapped. Daniel closed his eyes. I have already given everything this thing can take from me. Helena was silent. You are right, she said. I do not know what it cost you. And I should have seen what Martin was building inside my company long before you arrived. I mistook profitable control for effective leadership. That failure belongs to me. But 12 people are hanging above a ravine, and his people are still telling Eagle Crown not to use your design because admitting the truth would expose them. A car door closed outside Ruth's house. Seconds later, Vanessa knocked. She entered carrying a laptop bag and found Daniel beside the fireplace. She had already sent copies of the design purchase records, Summit Crest rejection, and media trail to state transportation regulators, independent safety investigators, Helena's legal team, and 3 journalists who agreed to hold publication until the emergency details were confirmed. Priya was prepared to provide a sworn statement. Lucas, after learning about Eagle Crown and realizing his silence could endanger more lives, had agreed to testify about Martin's threats and the falsified authorization. You are not walking back into this alone, Vanessa said. Not this time. Daniel stared at her. For years he had believed help came with judgment or obligation. Their marriage was still over. Ruth was still gone. Nothing had been repaired by a single act of courage. But accepting support did not make the burden less real. It made carrying it possible. He lifted the notebook from the fireplace. Tell Helena I am coming. The storm had reached the upper ridges when the helicopter approached Eagle Crown. Winds prevented it from landing near the trapped cabin, so Daniel, Helena, Priya, and a state rescue coordinator touched down beside the lower operations building. Vanessa remained in Denver coordinating the verified release of evidence through Helena's attorneys and regulators. Eagle Crown's control room was filled with alarms, radios, and frightened executives. On the main display, the stranded cabin swung beneath the cable nearly 200 feet above the ravine. 12 passenger indicators blinked inside it. The brake pressure graph fell in uneven steps. Each drop meant the primary system was slipping and forcing more weight onto the damaged secondary housing. Martin appeared on the central monitor from Ashford headquarters. Though removed from ordinary project control, he still had temporary access through the board member supporting the merger. "No unapproved modifications are to be installed," he said. "Any intervention using Mercer's device creates unacceptable liability." Daniel stepped toward the screen. "The current hardware is already failing." Martin's expression barely changed. "You are not authorized to make that determination." Helena struck her cane once against the floor. She no longer had direct authority over the division, so she did not pretend she could order the resort to act. Instead, she turned to Eagle Crown's general manager. "The decision is yours. My legal team will assume the company's share of liability, and I will sign a personal indemnity if necessary. But waiting because Martin fears exposure is also a decision." The resort manager looked at the live deformation readings, then authorized the rescue team to use Daniel as a technical advisor under the state coordinator's command. Daniel studied the sensor data cabin weight spare components and weather window. He divided the rescue into stages. The primary goal was to reduce dynamic movement. The second was to install a reinforced dual-contact collar. The third was to transfer passengers one at a time into a rescue cradle without sudden load changes. "No heroes," Daniel told the team. "Nobody moves without confirmation. Nobody improvises alone." Years earlier, he would have taken the most dangerous position himself and called that leadership. Now he understood that leadership meant preventing courage from becoming another form of recklessness. Daniel joined 2 certified high-angle rescuers and Priya. They traveled by snow vehicle to the nearest support tower, then climbed into wind strong enough to tear breath from their lungs. Ice coated the ladder rungs. The passengers watched through fogged windows as headlamps approached along the service line. One passenger was having a panic attack. Another had injured her shoulder when the cabin jolted. A child was crying. Daniel inspected the failing assembly through binoculars. The secondary bracket had twisted several degrees. A standard collar installation would no longer align. They would have to reduce tension, rotate the guide plate manually, and secure the load using a double-point configuration Daniel had drawn in the margin of the original notebook, but never tested under full operational weight. Before anyone touched the damaged assembly, the rescue team attached 2 temporary load arrest lines to the tower and transferred part of the cabin's weight onto a powered rescue winch. Only then did Daniel authorize work near the bent fastener. Martin's voice came through the radio, warning the resort that Daniel was attempting an unverified procedure. Then Helena's legal counsel entered the emergency conference. State regulators confirmed receipt of the time-stamped design and material records. Priya verified that the Glacier Point fasteners failed specification. Lucas appeared by secure video and admitted Martin's office had used his credentials after threatening his career. The supporting board member withdrew access from Martin as the remaining directors received the evidence. Martin's screen went dark. His authority did not collapse because one man defeated him in an argument. It collapsed because the truth no longer depended on one frightened person speaking alone. The trapped cabin dropped 6 inches. Metal screamed across the line. Daniel had no time to watch Martin fall. He directed the control station to release pressure in measured increments while the rescue team fixed temporary stabilizers to the tower. The first adjustment worked. The second caused the guide plate to jam under a ridge of ice. Unless the plate rotated, the locking collar could not seat against the housing. Daniel clipped into a secondary line and moved beyond the platform toward the exposed mechanism. Priya caught his arm. The wind is above the recommended limit. I know. Then we wait for it to fall. Daniel looked at the pressure reading. The bracket will fail first. He did not dismiss her fear or pretend danger was courage. The temporary lines are carrying part of the load. I need you controlling tension from here. If I say release, give me 1 inch. No more. Priya nodded. Daniel climbed out. The ravine opened beneath him, dark and white and impossibly deep. Wind drove ice against his face. Every movement had to be deliberate. He reached the jammed guide plate, cleared the ice with a hand tool, and attached the collar's first contact point. The cabin shifted. Daniel called for a 1-inch pressure release. The plate moved halfway, then stopped. The bent, cheap fastener blocked rotation. Because the rescue winch and temporary lines were now carrying part of the load, the exposed outer section was no longer bearing direct force. Daniel cut only the protruding portion, then used the collar's second surface to redirect the remaining load around the damaged point. Priya tightened the stabilizer. The control room reduced tension. The collar seated. The pressure graph leveled. For the first time in 20 minutes, the cabin stopped slipping. The team attached a rescue cradle and evacuated the passengers one by one. An elderly man came out first, then the injured woman, then a father carrying the crying child. The final passenger reached the tower as the storm swallowed the upper line in snow. Only after the empty cabin was secured did Daniel allow himself to climb back onto the platform. His knees gave way when his boots touched metal. Priya caught his harness and sat beside him while the wind roared through the structure. "Your design held," she said. Daniel looked at the rescuers' operators and engineers communicating across the line. The team held. By morning, the evidence against Martin had become impossible to contain. State investigators seized procurement records. Meridian Peak Capital suspended the merger. Martin was removed from the company and later charged with fraud, evidence destruction, obstruction, and reckless endangerment. The board member who protected him resigned under investigation. Helena remained chief executive, but she refused to treat the outcome as proof that the system had worked. The system protected him until employees risked their careers to expose him, she told the press. That is failure, not victory. She ordered an independent review, separated safety approval from financial leadership, and created protected reporting channels outside management. Daniel was publicly cleared. The injured Glacier Point technician confirmed that the locking collar had prevented the weighted cabin from descending uncontrollably, and that the platform impact resulted from the failed mounting hardware. Reporters who had called Daniel reckless now described him as a hero. He disliked both versions. One reduced him to a failure. The other erased the people who stood beside him. The Eagle Crown rescue did not become the basis for immediate commercial approval. Over the following months, the locking collar underwent independent fatigue testing, cold weather evaluation, repeated cycle analysis, installation review, and state certification. Only after those stages was it approved for deployment. Helena offered Daniel the position of Director of Field Safety and Legacy Systems. He accepted only after adding conditions. Major safety decisions would require an independent technical panel. Maintenance workers would have direct access to reporting channels outside their supervisors. Ashford would create a paid training pathway for mechanics, lift operators, and field technicians who lacked traditional degrees but possessed years of practical expertise. "You negotiate differently now," Helena observed. "I used to think being useful meant saying yes," Daniel replied. "Now I think it means knowing what should never depend on one person." His licensing agreement paid the debt from Ruth's care and allowed him to establish the Ruth Mercer Family Support Fund. The program helped caregivers obtain financial counseling, emergency respite care, and honest information before exhaustion turned love into isolation. Daniel placed one sentence from Ruth on every application form. "Love is not supposed to be a punishment you give yourself." Vanessa helped build the fund's public campaign but declined payment. Months later, she and Daniel met in Ruth's kitchen while preparing the house for sale. Daniel apologized without defending his intentions. He admitted that hiding money, fear, and decisions had denied Vanessa the right to choose how she wanted to love him. Vanessa apologized for treating uncertainty as failure and for believing a perfectly managed life could keep grief outside the door. They did not discuss reconciliation. Some endings did not need to be reversed to become meaningful. Forgiveness did not return the marriage. It allowed them to remember it without needing one person to be the villain. 1 year after the Eagle Crown rescue, Daniel returned to Summit Crest for the installation of the certified locking system across the resort's oldest gondola line. Executives arranged podium cameras and a banner carrying his name. Daniel spoke for less than 3 minutes. He said the system had not been created by one brilliant man. It had been built from the observations of maintenance crews, rescuers, machinists, engineers, caregivers, and every person who had warned that something was wrong before those in power were ready to listen. Then he left the stage and went downstairs to the maintenance room where younger technicians had already found 3 problems with the installation schedule. Daniel listened to each one. On the wall of his new office hung a photograph of Ruth standing before her final class. On the back, in her handwriting, were the words, "Vanessa had found inside an old box. Do not confuse being unseen with having no value." Vanessa arrived after the ceremony carrying Daniel's metal toolbox. Inside was Ruth's old labeling pen, the one she had used to write Daniel's name on his school supplies when he was a boy. Daniel laughed when he saw it. Vanessa asked whether he remembered the helicopter outside the courthouse. "Everyone thinks that was the day my life changed," he said. "Was it not? It opened a door." Daniel looked through the maintenance room window at the gondola cabins crossing the valley. "The change came later when I stopped believing I had to walk through every door alone." They drank coffee together. There was no kiss, no promise, and no attempt to rebuild the life they had lost. There was only peace between 2 people who had learned that love could remain real even after it changed shape. Helena joined Daniel on the observation deck as the first public cabin traveled safely over the ravine. She asked what he believed power meant now. Daniel watched the operators, technicians, and inspectors communicating across the line. "Power is being able to make people obey," he said. "Leadership is building something that stays safe when they are no longer afraid of you." The cabins continued moving through the snow, supported not by one perfect component, but by many points sharing the weight. That was the lesson Daniel carried forward. No person proves their worth by carrying everything alone. No leader becomes strong by silencing those below them, and no failure can erase the value of honest work done with care. If this story reminded you that true leadership is measured by how many people are heard, protected, and given the courage to speak, subscribe and stay with us for more stories about the quiet strength that can change lives.